The Story of the Windlenot Museum. Chapter 8. Tombs of Healing. Richard Kale couldn't believe how much better he felt now that he had caught the ash exupi. He returned to the museum lobby, followed by Carl Kolchak and Michael McNeil, and ran over to the fountain. Since Michael had captured the water exupi, he knew it would be safe to look in the water. He looked like he wasn't back to his normal appearance. He turned to the others and said, "How do I look?" His friend, Michael, just shrugged. "Honestly, you still look like you did after the first exupi attack, about 10 years older than you actually are." Richard nodded but smiled at the statement. It was a step in the right direction. He then noticed as Carl was looking around the lobby. He wondered what the reporter was looking for, and realized that the reporter was looking up to the top of a stairway in the lobby. He followed the gaze of the reporter and realized that they had explored all the doors on the ground floor of the lobby. The next step would be to explore the upper levels. He was also aware that Carl wasn't exactly young. "Worried that there will be a lot of climbing, Carl?" He watched as Carl smiled and said, "No, are you kidding? I handled that clock tower stairway with no problem. Mind you, I've also climbed up the stairs of a 40-story tall building. I'm sure I can handle a couple of simple stairs like this." Richard then glanced up the stairs and above them to the chandelier. Something seemed odd about it, but he wasn't sure what it was. He then said, "Let's head up then. It looks like everything is clear up there." He then ran forward and climbed up the steps. As he climbed up, he heard the sounds of small crystals tinkling together, like a wind was moving the chandelier. He reached the top of the steps and backed away from the chandelier, and realized it had a green tint to it. There was an exupi in the chandelier, most likely the crystal exupi. He then said to Carl and Michael as they started up, "Be careful, an exupi is hiding in the chandelier." He quickly moved forward to help Carl up the steps, and saw the reporter was starting to appear winded. He then heard the reporter say, "Either this place suddenly has too many stairs, or I've been up too long." Richard realized what Carl might be hinting at. He had lost track of the time they had been in the museum. Of course, with the exupi around the place, he couldn't fault himself for forgetting. He had finally helped Carl away from the chandelier and saw Michael near it when it happened. Michael had turned around to see if he had moved far enough away, and the exupi leapt out of the chandelier. It had blended in perfectly, and now it looked like the chandelier had grown teeth. He and Carl quickly grabbed Michael and pulled him forward, but not before his friend had aged 10 years. Instead of looking like his normal self, his friend looked like he was in his mid-20s. They all waited for the sensation of the attack to pass out of Michael. As they sat, he looked at Carl and said, "Tell me, Carl, when you had said you climbed all those stairs, why had you done that?" He listened as Carl spoke. "It happened decades ago. A rash of jewel thefts were linked to an ancient Native American demon called the Diablero. The jewels it stole were never found, because the thing had sent them off to the other side. When I had found the thing, it was on the 39th floor of a vacant building. The elevators had only worked up to the 5th floor, so I had to climb all those stairs." He then heard Michael start to stir. "After the exupi attacked, I felt like I'd done all that climbing." He then watched as his friend finally sat up and punched the floor. "I can't believe I let that thing get me." Richard helped his friend up and said, "It's not your fault. Besides, if you hadn't gotten hit, Carl might have gotten hit." He glanced over at Carl, who shivered a bit. He then said, "We just need to be more careful. We've managed to capture two of the Exupi, and we know there are more lurking around. Now, shall we check out the doors over there?" He motioned to the door that the balcony had led to. As they walked over to it, he noticed that Carl was looking out over the whole lobby. He looked over the new view of the lobby and was impressed. Finally, they all passed, and they headed towards the door. When they opened the door, he was stunned by the room. To the left was a large wall that seemed like it was part of an Egyptian tomb. In the back of the room, he could tell there was a display behind the wall. But to his right, Richard could see a familiar symbol apparently shining on the floor. Professor Windlenot had drawn it on the ground, and it was on the book about the Exupi. He looked ahead and saw a gold plate on the stand. He quickly ran over to it and read over what he was looking at. Before he could say anything, he heard a voice come from in the tomb of the Exupi, as the display was called. "Hey, Rich, it looks like this room is devoted to the Exupi." As he walked into the tomb, he looked around and saw 13 stands, each with a shape for each vessel to contain the Exupi. He also noticed the relief painted on the back wall. As he looked over what everything meant, he heard Mike remark, "This is creepy. It looks like some deity sent them out. Do you really think it called them Exupi?" He then heard Carl say, as the reporter entered the tomb, "Probably. While we might not think the names make any sense, they have meaning." He then watched as Carl looked around at the displays and said, "Maybe we can place the pots here. It can't be safe to carry them all around." He thought about it. Carl had a point. And the Exupi didn't seem to show any way of being able to transport a vessel. He nodded and said, "Yes, let's place the ones we've captured, as well as the ones that held Beth and Professor Windlenot. We'll just have to check in on them from time to time." They placed the 4 pots in the room on their matching podiums. When they left the display, he noticed something on the wall by the plate. Richard didn't understand why he hadn't noticed it before, but it was one of the skull dials. He opened the brochure he had grabbed earlier and turned the dial until the glowing skull matched the brochure. When he was done, he looked up to see Carl had now moved back to the door and pushed a button on the wall. Soon, a narrative about tombs and quests to secure their place in the afterlife played. By the time the audio finished, he looked around to see Michael had moved to the back of the room, where there were other displays. He walked over to where his friend was standing and realized what had captivated his friend. The display in the room was that of a sphinx facing a sarcophagus. They all walked over to the display, and he looked up at the sphinx as Carl and Michael looked at the sarcophagus. As he looked at it, he noticed there seemed to be a visible mouth area, and a button seemed to be near it. He then heard Carl say, "Hey, Michael, this might be another puzzle of sorts. These parts of the pillars move." He glanced back to see the 2 turning parts of the pillars. He then looked at the sphinx again and looked down at the floor. He could see an obvious discoloration at the base. He pushed the area and wasn't surprised when a small step slid out of the display. He then climbed up the step and pushed the button. He almost jumped back when the Sphinx spoke aloud. "The names of the heretics will be forever stricken from the face of history." Richard quickly stepped down and turned to face the others. As he stood there, Michael looked at the pillars and said, "What's that supposed to mean? Are we supposed to find the names of the ones the Inquisition hunted down?" He watched Carl look at the pillars. "I don't think so. I think the Inquisition came long after the time of the pharaohs. Richard closed his eyes for a moment and tried to remember everything he had seen. He then remembered that in the Egyptian book there was the name of a pharaoh and his queen who had tried to convert Egypt into a one-deity culture. He quickly pulled out the notepad and turned it to the images. It means heretics to the deities the Egyptians worshipped. These two were the heretics. We need to get their names on the obelisks. He watched as Carl and Michael turned the pieces, and soon the sarcophagus opened. They all looked in and weren't surprised to see a pot with the icon for wood on the side. When they all leaned back, he heard Carl say, "Well, we found another pot. Shall we take it with us?" Richard shook his head. "No, let's leave it here. At least here we know where it is." He then glanced off to his left and saw a small path leading to another display. From what he could tell, it was a display of a low-ranking tomb for poor Egyptians. He noticed the rags in the tomb, but something told him there was more to it than that. He then walked back to the large tomb front in the side of the room and noticed something odd. There had been a door up the steps. He walked up the steps and noticed a sliding panel on the door, which hid a puzzle. When the panel opened, he saw 25 rotating panels, and something told him when he had them all right, they could continue. He then started to work on opening the door. Michael McNeil watched as his friend started working on the door panel. He was still shaken up about what had happened at the chandelier, but he knew he would get what he lost back. He then glanced over at the mural of the pyramids. For a minute, he froze. He wasn't sure why, but something about the image gave him a feeling of foreboding. It was as if fate was trying to tell him something. He was almost lost in that thought when Carl said, "Hey, Michael, are you all right? You seemed lost for a moment." He looked at the reporter and smiled. "I'm all right. I think my mind just wandered for a moment. Maybe it's lack of sleep." He watched as Carl nodded and said, "I'd wager it is. When you don't sleep or are afraid to, your mind starts playing tricks on you. However, I won't tell you about the one time I had to be careful about going to sleep. Besides, I think Richard just opened the door." He glanced up at the door and saw Richard standing next to it, and the door was open. "Voila! The way is open. Now, I think it's time to move on." He then watched as his friend looked in the door and then back at them. "You know, all of a sudden, I feel like I'm one of the people who found Tut's tomb." As they all went down the steps, they heard the door behind them close. It must have been set to close once people were clear of it. He looked back as Carl stepped back up and pushed a button almost invisible in the shadows. Soon the door opened again. "Best we know where the button is again." When they reached the landing, Michael pushed another button, and they were greeted by the automated voice saying about man's fascination with death. When the voice finished, he looked over at his friend. "One of the people who found Tut's tomb." What an odd choice of words. He watched as Richard shrugged and said, "Well, with the motif of the last room, it seemed fitting. Besides, it's not like we will find a corpse down here." He wondered if his friend would be right. They had found one corpse and two spirits of the three who had been lost in the museum years ago. When he reached the bottom of the steps, he heard Carl say, "That would be wishful thinking. But if I'm remembering right, there were three people and we've seen the spirits of two of them, and the corpse that went with the one. That means there are two corpses left to find, and one spirit. I think it would be safe to say we can't rule anything out yet. He then watched as Carl walked around the room, stopping to look in what looked like a hut. He then noticed as Richard walked over to what looked like a ship, and saw his friend was turning another skull dial. He then walked and started to look over some of the other items in the room. He noticed that Carl had stepped over and stopped at something on the floor. It had been near what looked like a decorative coffin. As he approached where Carl was standing, he noticed something about the elaborate thing across from the coffin. He knelt down and examined the base as Carl said, "I think I just found Merrick's diary." He glanced back as Carl started to page through it. "Looks like the boy was a bit obsessed with Professor Windlenot and the museum. It even has info about the night they came here in it." As he heard Carl continuing to page through the diary, he pushed something on the base and was stunned when a small drawer came out. He glanced at, almost surprised that he was looking at an IQ puzzle. It was one where the task was to remove all the pegs, leaving one in the center. He then looked up and saw Richard was standing next to Carl with his back to the coffin. He quickly got up and looked at the two. "Hey guys, I think I just found another puzzle. It might open another door or reveal another hidden item." He then saw Richard smile and lean back. "Then solve it, Mike. I think it's more likely to reveal something, since the doors are right in front of us." He was startled when Richard started to lose his balance, since the lid of the coffin moved. He quickly helped keep his friend from slipping into the coffin, but realized that wasn't a worry. The coffin was already filled with a withered corpse. He could see Richard wasn't ready for that, since his friend moved behind the coffin. He then looked at Carl, who was now looking at the corpse. "Is it Merrick?" He watched as Carl looked over the body before finally hearing the response. "Yes, I mean these clothes on the corpse look like a guy's clothing, and the other spirit was a girl. Of course that doesn't answer which Exupi killed him." Michael was stunned when Richard said, "It was his jade Exupi." He went to ask how his friend knew that, when his friend held up a green skull. I think he thought of carrying this as a weapon. He probably didn't realize it was hiding in this. He then watched as Richard put it down again. "Maybe we should get out of this room as soon as possible." He looked back at the puzzle and said, "Give me one moment, Rich. I think this puzzle hides something." He started doing the puzzle, watching each peg disappear as he jumped it. He had done this puzzle many times and had memorized the ways to beat it. Soon after starting it, he finished it and the panel closed. As it closed, another one opened and he looked in it. Contained in the hidden drawer was another pot. He looked at it and smiled when he saw the picture on it. "Rich, I think I just found the pot to hold the other Exupi that attacked you." He heard his friend say, "Leave it there for now. Once we know where they all are, we can just run through and catch them all." He then got up and headed over to the door where both Carl and Richard were waiting. It was time to move on to the next room. When Michael had joined them, Carl Kolchak turned around and opened the door to the next room. Instantly, they were greeted by the recording of some sort of chanting. When they stepped further into the room, he saw figurines to his right and a mock hut to his left. He moved to the left and said, "Let's head this way." As they all done so, Carl froze. A couple of thoughts ran through his mind at this moment. The first was that the room was a dead end, but he quickly dismissed it. If the room was a dead end, then the cameras showed rooms that were inaccessible. Second was the fact that he saw footprints on the floor. That meant that someone, most likely one of the two teens from years ago, passed through the wall on the far side, which told him there was a door there. The last thing in his mind was a story from decades ago. Seeing the figure next to the drum somehow reminded him of the zombie killings. Part of him expected the figure to advance, while another part of him remembered the voodoo priestess that had summoned the zombie. As he stood there, remembering how close he came to losing his life that day, he heard Michael say, "Something wrong, Carl?" It was enough to break him out of those memories. He glanced at the African-American boy and said, "Just reflected back on another case for a moment. I'll be fine. Do either of you see any clues on how to get out of this room, other than heading back?" He watched as Michael looked over at the drums, while Richard looked opposite of the drums. He noticed the boy was looking up, and then glanced in the same direction. He saw some scaffolding in the room. Something told him that was a clue to getting out, maybe a secret panel in the ceiling. But he then noticed Richard looking over at Michael and the drums. He noticed that Michael had looked at Richard at the same moment. "You've noticed something, didn't you?" When the boy nodded, he heard Michael say, "Are you going to tell us?" He watched as Richard walked over to the figure and pulled something out of its hands. It looked like a hammer. And then watched as Richard looked over the drums again. He watched as Richard hit each drum once and heard each one make a different sound. He then said, "The drums are the key. We just need the right tune, and I think we all saw it on the monitors." It was then it hit him. The scaffolding they had seen before from the top in the tower monitors. He quickly pulled out his notebook and paged through it. "He's right. In order to open the wall, you just have to play the tune. Now, where was it?" He kept turning pages and stopped. "Ramta, Boba, Taramba. That's the tune." He watched as Richard then swung the hammer, hitting each drum in order. As he hit each drum, he heard the boy say, "I want to bang on the drum all day." In that moment, he couldn't help but laugh at the boy's choice of words. He watched as Michael laughed a bit and then heard the boy say, "I think we needed that. Now open the door, Rich." Soon, he heard the wall slide open. As the wall slid, he heard Richard say, "Ask and ye shall receive." He saw a mischievous grin cross the boy's face. He then watched as Richard returned the hammer and saw the boy look into the room. The boy stepped back for a moment and said, "I don't like the look of that room. It might be the snake in there." Carl watched Michael look into the room and then did the same. When he saw the large snake along the far wall, he jumped back. He shook his head for a moment and then said, "Well, it may look imposing, but we need to go in there. Right now, we need to keep moving forward and hopefully find all the pots to catch the Exupi." He then led the way into the next room and hoped that this next room didn't hide any Exupi.